Do you ever just look around at the world and think, how did we get into this situation? How the hell did we get into this mess?
And then you turn on the telly or doom scroll on your phone and still feel like there are no answers? Maybe it's because our attention spans are shrinking fast. Maybe it's because analysis is reduced to 280 character snippets filtered through the mire of social media. Or maybe it's because carefully packaged sound bites and glib takes feed the news cycle.
More meaningless words from faceless suits shining precisely zero light on the many, many crises that we all face. So it's time for something a little different.
I'm joining 6 guests from all walks of life who want to put aside the sound bites and hot takes that dominate our media today.
No blocking, no muting.
Unconventional times need a more unconventional approach. Our 6 guests delve into all the aspects of our changing cultural output. Where is counterculture today? Is cancel culture really real? And do our national cultures still matter in this globalised world? If we're going to fix this mess we're in, it will take dissent, nonconformity and frankness to give people space to change their views and to spend the time we need seeing what another person is really trying to say.
So, in good faith, let's begin. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. It's great to have you all here. So our first topic this evening is on counterculture. It's quite broad, so if you'll indulge me on my own definition of counterculture just to get us started. So I would say that decades ago, we spoke of a distinct counterculture, like ways of living and artistic expression that was diametrically opposed to the mainstream business, government, the main way of operating day to day. And I suppose what I'm interested in exploring is, does that type of oppositional culture exist today? Did that idea of a counterculture ever really exist, or is it just a kind of imagination that we have? Or are the self-proclaimed radicals of today's counterculture too easily absorbed into the mainstream? Because I think when we think of counterculture, my mind immediately goes to the 1960s, and maybe that's just a fantasy. So I'm going to throw it open there, and please feel free just to have a go.
Maybe the bigger question of, is there a counterculture now, is counter what? Like, what are we against? What are young people? I say we. What are people younger than me? Like, what are they against? And it's very difficult to say. I mean, I can't think of a new musical genre since hip hop. Since the 1990s, we've just been repeating the culture of past decades over and over again. It's this strange thing about Kat, you mentioned like the 1960s. We tend to think of that as the birth of youth culture. I tend to think of the birth of youth culture as the 1920s. The disillusionment that came after the First World War. And the First World War is also basically the beginning of the death of social conservatism as a force, as an ideological force in capitalism and modernity. I don't really think conservatism really survived the First World War. That broke a lot of people's allegiances to past generations. It opened, Pandora's box famously, communism, fascism. Both sides of that rupture in European culture decried their father's generation very famously. And out of that you saw, young art movements, literary movements, the sorts of things that you don't see today. I mean, when was the last time there was a literary movement? It sounds so old-fashioned now. But we're now so far into that curve. There is no social conservatism. What do people rebel against?
Well, that's the thing, is that's all that's left. The only thing that's left is culture war. Politics is dead, right? So the only area of contestation is culture. And so there's no literary movement because you have people who are counterculture is their political movement. It's well, the masses think this. We've got to change the masses' culture, and literature is a vehicle to do that. So you have to be very careful about what you say here and the words that you're using, and make sure that it's not offensive. And you've got people whose job it is to read through. You've got sensitivity readers in publishing houses that then raise questions about things, because that's it. Counterculture is politics now, and that happened in the 60s as well. That's when it started. The personal became political. When the personal became political, nothing was political anymore. Everything became personal.
David, can I just pick up on something you said there? You said that there's been no new musical genres since the 1980s.
Yeah, so the late 80s maybe.
I mean, I think that's quite debatable.
Yeah.
I think.
Give me some examples. Give me some examples.
I mean, I'm not going to try and be, down
Grunge.
with youth cultures, grunge, but even more recent things like grime.
Or drill or something. But I mean, they're subcategories,
But there's also.
I actually
movements as well.
So I think one of the interesting things about counterculture is, I mean, I'm not young either, but the movement that many people my age were engaged in, where I came from, was rave, and that I think was a distinct form of music. It was a genre quite different to anything else. There's a fascinating documentary I'd recommend you watch called Dancing on Narrow Ground by Des Bell, who's a sociologist at Queen's in Belfast, about the rave culture in Belfast in the 1990s and how it was transgressive because it moved across sectarian boundaries, which were the boundaries that were imposed upon society at that time. His previous work had been on punk, which had also done something similar. And I mean, I have this very strong memory, and I thought that I must have misremembered it, of punks with the huge mohawk hair. So I was born in 1980, and I remember that. It must have been 1986 or 87, walking down the street that I lived in, and punk was over by then, except in Belfast, because in Belfast it was a way for people to express that non-sectarian identity. So you had loyalists, you had Republicans, and you had punks. And I think that was an expression of counterculture. It was a very clear expression of counterculture. And I think that happened in rave as well.
The North is a fascinating example of that, though, because the North, I mean, North of Ireland is one of the last countries in Europe, well, Western Europe, where social conservatism did have a very strong hold. It had a...
Dolls.
It does. But it had, in the 80s in particular, it still had a party led by Ian Paisley, who was simultaneously the leader of a church and a party, and the only figure like that in Western Europe at the time. So Northern Ireland's maybe an interesting exception there, where you could still have a counterculture way into the 80s and 90s.
I mean, I think what's interesting about what you're saying, Peter, about this idea of punk, of rave, is where does that happen now? Where is that happening now in Britain in particular?
Nowhere. There is no tribalism. Only in black underground music is there that force of tribalism. You don't see it anymore. Like we said, you had the punks, the rockers in the 50s. You had the Beat generation in the 60s. You had the sort of Led Zeppelin-y heavy metal types, and then you had punk. Then you had the 80s come along, New Romantic. So there's nothing like that anymore for kids. The kids now are
listening to podcasts.
They're listening to podcasts. It's about the environment. It's about non-binary. It's about they're not interested. Music's just music. It's so homogenized and generic. If you're looking for a tribe now, it's over. I mean, if you go to gigs and you look at gigs now, and if you go to an Idols concert, who are this massive band at the minute, and you go to that gig, there's a cross-section of everyone. When I went to gigs as a kid, I didn't see any mums and dads at a gig. It was full of young people losing their minds and loving the band that they'd paid to go and see. Now you could be standing at the back and you'll see a lot of pates. A lot of baldy-haired men sitting in that audience, bouncing along with the kids. I mean, it's not music anymore, like the counterculture.
So if you don't get that kind of tribalism in music, what is the medium? What is the sphere?
I don't know, and I have kids about that age, and that's what they're interested in. It's not aligning yourself with a musical tribe anymore and thinking we want to be different, and so they're off on a whole different kind of...
I think there's a really interesting thing. I think the mid-20th century was characterised by this sort of mass society, where people were members of, they worked in big factories, they were in big trade unions.
Yeah.
People were identified through the things to which they belonged, and sometimes that was religion.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen a decline of a lot of those institutional attachments.
100%.
And I think a lot of those musical movements just mapped onto that. So you were a punk in the way that your mum might have been a Methodist.
Yeah.
And Methodists used to have uniforms, and now punks had uniforms.
Yeah.
You could identify them in the street. All of those sorts of things. And I think we've moved a very long way from that. And one of the things that I find very interesting is about a lot of this, and I think modernity was about resistance to power. It was about resistance to totalizing power, and I think we find a lot of that opportunity for resistance in very much more individual ways now. And I think that's partly why it's around things like non-binary, which are very strong personal identifications rather than group identifications.
Yeah.
Can I say, I was born in Belfast in 1952. I'm from Northern Ireland. That's where I grew up. Culture, certainly culture with a capital C, but even quite a lot of it with a small c, was always non-sectarian. It was always where people could be. Of course, there were the political war murals, and there are some people who are prepared to sing "God Save the Queen," and there are others who aren't. Fine, but generally, it was where
I
people
have
could
to
meet.
challenge that. I mean, you look at what within Scottish society certainly, and I didn't spend the 80s or 90s in the UK at all, so I appreciate I'm coming to this as an outsider. But something that is very, very clearly cultural are things like football songs. And those ran through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and continue to this day. And very, very entrenched tribalism within those. So why is that not legitimate culture, big or small c?
I'm not saying that culture can't be tribalized, and in fact, people coalesce around different competing tastes a lot, and it is very much like the football club type of tribalism, whether it's the mods and the rockers or the punks later and so on. But artists, as a general rule, are not exclusive. They're not nationalistic. They're not particularly class-ridden. There are always exceptions to every generalization. But artists, as a general rule, try and rise above all these divisions.
Well, I just want to take maybe issue with the idea that these new kinds of forms of counterculture are they are individualized, maybe not entirely so, because they do connect to an identity that's beyond themselves. But I don't know how different that is from the past, because if we look to the 1960s as the epitome of counterculture, this is the rise of lifestyle as your counterculture, right? So it's the death of collective movements and the rise of you enact your politics in your daily life. This is just the epitome of that. I mean, the end goal is more self-contained, but it is a continuation of the individualization of political movements, of cultural movements, as expressions of who you become as an individual. And that's been something that's been going on for a long, long time.
The counterculture of the 60s, and we tend to, if we want to be precise, we tend to say 1964 to 1974, was of course about changes in music and art and other things, but it was also in a decade when the student population doubled. And it doubled without the universities being able to cope very well with the great increase in pressure. It also coincides with the first real takeoff of the purchasing power of young people. And you could say that it's a generational thing, which is what people said at the time. I mean, one of the things you mentioned is today you can go to great gigs and concerts, and far more generations are there than ever used to be the case. But it also coincides with the growth in consumerism. And we are now at a very heightened point after 70 years of unstopped consumer growth, where we perhaps arguably have a young generation who think that the only good things are things which are subject to consumer choice. Even gender
I mean,
should be a consumer choice.
I think that the main difference for me between the idea of like 1960s counterculture and the countercultures, like political countercultures that are very much part of today. You've talked about this in your kids, like saying that this is like part of their counterculture, whether that's gender politics, climate crisis, race politics, whatever that is. In the 1960s, someone like Martin Luther King was actually a figure of terror for the establishment. It's not until after he dies that the image becomes sanitized. Same with someone like Che Guevara, like a figure of terror for the ruling elite. But after death, like he kind of again becomes sanitized. And there's a period of time that happens. Whereas now, I mean, in the 1960s, you didn't get General Electric putting out statements saying, we center the voices of the Black Panthers, for example. You just didn't get that.
Yeah.
Whereas now you get major corporations very quickly taking on the language of what would previously have been a subversive challenge to the corporate agenda now forms the very basis for the corporate agenda. So I think that something has shifted in terms of the speed of absorption.
Well, and also that these were mass movements, right? Like Martin Luther King, what he was speaking to was a mass movement of, and even Black Panthers as well, talking to the working classes, talking to a very large section of society. Whereas I think now, and it grew since the 60s, is our counterculture is against the masses as opposed to for the masses. And so that's why capitalists have very little trouble incorporating it. Yes, these figures needed some time to sanitize, but now it's very easily taken up because it's against a mass movement, against the mass of society. It's for small groups, it's a bit of divide and conquer as well.
But even if you look at even something like BLM in America, right? I mean, that was huge, right? And at its most militant points, and it's an interesting movement actually if you look at it in the long durée, because under Obama, it was smaller, but it was much more working class, and it was more African American. And then by the time it was going on under Trump, it was larger, more middle class, and more white. If you look at the stats of how it was done, but even under Trump, there were some very violent manifestations. It was very large. It did put the frighteners up, the American establishment. But see, about 3 months after that, not only did you have the entirety of corporate America swing behind it, all the Nike, Disney, etc., etc. And the big tech companies and so on. The US Army, the US Navy, and the US Air Force.
The CIA
well,
has done very similar stuff.
Yeah, of course, during the civil rights movement, although it was kind of different. So they made a public pronouncement basically backing BLM against Trump, right? Which is something that the US security forces, A, are not supposed to do, and B, it's extraordinarily rare in American history. You're right, of course, that how did Martin Luther King die? We don't really know, but he could have been killed by the American state. But at the same time, there were times when the US security state were kind of quasi-supportive of the civil rights movement as well when it was starting to win and so on. So that capitalism's always had that capacity to move in behind dissenting movements and support them. But I think that is the worry. I mean, you got people who dismissed BLM straight away and said, the establishment are already on top of it. They weren't, but it only took a few months until they had it. And that's my worry.
One of the things is that the establishment is not a singularity. The establishment gets divided. And so half of it might want to kill Martin Luther King and the other half wants to save his life. Half of the Polish Secret Service wanted to kill John Paul II, the other half wanted to save his life. The one thing which distinguishes human beings from animals is we're capable of hypocrisy. Animals are not. When people say the political is personal, the personal is political. Yes, but that can go too far as well. It's also the community. It's also the group. And I do think that we've been through a long fashion wave period, which we're coming out of now, where we've focused too much over a period of 30 years on individual opportunity and individual chances, and not working enough and thinking enough collectively. But now young people are again asking for the answers to really big questions, and I think that's great. To me, today feels like the early 60s.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you draw that distinction between individual action or individual expression and collective expression, because I think there is something in what you were saying. You know, we've lost the era of mass trade union membership, mass religious following, that kind of thing. And I think one of the things, maybe we are looking for counterculture in places, or we are seeking to identify it in places that actually aren't relevant anymore. Yeah. So where is K-pop? It's not in a geographical space in the same way as punk in Belfast was. It is online, and I think the digital tools that people have at their disposal completely transform that. And you know, David, you were talking about Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing. Why was it that it took off when it did? You know, when I think, and I'm not saying that this is what happened everywhere, but one of the things that was very clear, we were in lockdown in the UK, in Scotland. Everybody was doing TikTok dances and making banana bread and that kind of thing. You know, Instagram, TikTok, social media was full of that. And suddenly it turned into BLM protests. And I think there was a moment that was enabled by the digital platforms that transgressed geopolitical boundaries, that transgressed all of the old, if I can call them that, old sort of locations of culture, yeah, in a way that we hadn't really had before. And so you had us being in Scotland knowing more about George Floyd than we knew about any of the other millions of black people who are murdered by the police, you know, because of that moment, because it was a coming together of both the timing, the platform. What else were people doing? They were stuck in their houses doing nothing. And I think that's an interesting sort of thing to mix into all of this, because it changes our notion of where culture happens.
There's something absolutely fascinating about this, which is as somebody who tries to use technology for political ends, there's a Instagram looked to me to be designed to be apolitical. It was something that was image focused, where you couldn't communicate complex ideas, where it was all about you know, the selfie, you know, kind of as the expression of individualism. And then at that moment, at the banana bread to George Floyd moment, Instagram became absolutely full of political content. Yeah. And designed political content that I think was probably easier to consume than the sorts of things I might have written or that we might have tried to communicate in other ways. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I think that speaks a lot to the really deep need for people to express themselves politically. So even though this space was set up to make it almost impossible to do political expression, people, upon finding out about George Floyd, decided they were going to turn an apolitical space into something political.
Or the political statements became part of people's selfie identities.
Yeah, yeah, and in the same way as socialism was part of a mass identity in the 1960s.
Where would BLM and the Floyds be without the video?
Yeah.
And the mobile phones with cameras in them is a 21st century phenomenon. It starts in 2000 and it grows to the point now where very quickly everybody has a camera. Stories don't travel unless they have pictures. Northern Ireland.
We worry something about the Instagram thing. Right, now, I don't have a fully formed idea on this, so be patient. But I wonder if that BLM moment that you're describing, and I do recognise the picture that you're painting, but I think that could only have happened with an American political moment. Because I think that is the nature of something like Instagram. And what then happened was you had the exportation, the wholesale exportation of an American political and cultural moment into countries that have a completely different racial history. Like the specifics of the African American experience within the United States of America is very specific to the United States of America. Whereas then you had these BLM protests that occurred in Scotland. Do you know what I mean? A predominantly white country, different relationship with race, different relationship with like colonialism, all these different things. But it was this kind of export. And I think that in that export, it becomes depoliticized and more like a cultural product, like this the selfie becomes the political identity, becomes the portrayal of like who you are as a person, and connecting yourself to this like idea of American culture rather than anything that was about raising political consciousness.
That's the thing. Like Fred Hampton, somebody like Fred Hampton from the Black Panthers, he preached racial solidarity. You know, blacks and whites unite, that kind of thing, and working class against the capitalists. He was shot in his sleep with his pregnant girlfriend next to him. Other kinds of movements that preach division and that kind of diffuse the aggressor. So who's the aggressor there? Okay, the police, yes, but generally kind of white people. And then you want to be a nice, good white person, so then you, oh no, I'm not one of those. So you start to put forward this identity, I'm not an aggressor, and so on. It's divisive. So you can see these kinds of movements that were very dangerous because they were universalists. They get absolutely pushed out of polite society, literally like killed out of existence.
Yeah.
Sure.
And then these kinds of movements that preach this kind of like look at each other with shifty eyes. Can't get enough of it. You know, capitalists. This is wonderful. You know, and all of a sudden everybody's celebrating it. Then I start to wonder. I don't know. From the beginning, was it radical? I'm not sure. I don't know. Yes, probably. Of course, it was from the beginning. But the words that it expressed, through which it expressed grievance, were far too easily used to divide people, and I think that's part of the reason why it was so easily taken up into the mainstream culture.
Well, I was going to ask about this, and this is kind of what I'm worried about, the kind of deterritorialization of politics through things like Instagram and stuff like that, right? Is that that deterritorialization is like inherently sort of anti-democratic in a way, right? Because, I mean, a perfect example is, you're absolutely right, like George Floyd became like a household name in Western Europe. But, you know, just at the bottom of this continent, in the Mediterranean Sea, over the last 60 years, 60,000 people have drowned in the Med. 60,000. Almost all of them black and brown, right? And they died for that reason, in quite an explicit sense, because Europe's immigration regime is expressly racial. You have free movement if you're European, and Europe is a racial concept. If you're non-European, you don't share the same civic rights, which is quite a departure from even traditional liberal attitudes about how you organise things like rights, legal rights. But I bet you that most of the people who marched on the streets for George Floyd in Western Europe overwhelmingly voted Remain in Britain, overwhelmingly voted Remain in the European referendum, and were completely unaware of that situation. The problem with an image-based culture like that, with a kind of meme-based culture like that, is you end up, it responds not only to the impulses of the mass of the population, it frankly also responds to like state censorship. That information that 60,000 people drowned in the Med in the last 10 years is not censored as such. You can find it if you type it into Google, but you can't see it on the TV, you can't read it in the newspapers by and large. So that culture responds not only to these kind of memeable impulses, it responds to state power. It responds to like dominant ideology in society. George Floyd, his death became an acceptable protest. Protest over the 60,000 people who drowned in the Med is not an acceptable protest because it says something really profound about how we've organised our civilization in the last 20 or 30 years. The police can be bad apples. The European Union can't be a bad apple. You know what I mean?
And ironically, that is one of the best examples of institutional racism.
Yeah.
Like, institutional racism has come to mean lots of people in that institution are racist. Why don't you hire my consultancy and we will teach them not to be so racist? And the capitalist says, yes, my workers are terribly racist. I will buy from you, thank you. Whereas actually institutional racism means, at its best, you don't even have to be a racist. Just by ticking the boxes, you reproduce racist outcomes. You don't have to be like a swastika-carrying person to work in immigration in the UK. You can actually be quite open and wonderful and fly your flags and so on with rainbows and everything. And still, your day job means that you effectively keep 60,000 people trying to get across the Mediterranean and drowning. That's institutional racism. That's what people should be angry about.
I wanted to come back to something that you'd said, which was about young people today. I want to pick up on this because I think there might be a variety of attitudes about it. And that's, you know, I suppose it's I'm a geriatric millennial. That's my category. I'll just, be upfront about that. But when people talk about the Zoomers, like this new Zoomer generation, I feel like there's a big narrative about how they're the most radical generation that's ever existed. And I kind of like, you are going to change the world. Like, this is where change is happening. And you've got all these young people who are invested in these types of social movements or political movements. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And
I didn't know the Generation Z, that the Z stood for Zimmer. Sounds interesting. Maybe it should.
I think it's a play on boomer.
Oh, I see. Right, yes.
So, boomers versus zoomers.
Okay. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of politicization in the universities. Students debated with their teachers openly, and the teachers felt that that was okay most of the time, particularly in the social sciences. But I like to think that while there was generational dispute and differences of the past, which I remember, well, bloody hell, move out of the way, make room for me. I like to think, oh no, we've been there. We're from the 60s and 70s. Talk to us. We can be right on. We can be cool. Well, maybe that's a bit of a self-delusion.
I'm very aware that there are no Zoomers in here. I'm also a geriatric millennial. But if I was I feel a certain I feel sorry for the generation below mine for this reason, which is when I was young, when I was about 20, 18, 19, 20, I very distinctly remember people saying to me, a generation or two generations older, your generation is going to change the world.
Yeah.
There was a really strong
chance.
thing of
No chance.
can't be asked.
We made a mess.
Yeah, and I remember being told that, and I thought, why are people saying this so much? But you start to believe it when you're very young, and you think, yeah, we are different. We are like a special generation, and maybe every generation thinks it's special. Yeah. But I think there's a special kind of pressure to be you're going to be the special ones. You're going to be. This is a terrible phrase that's turned up now. The change makers. You're going to make the change and all this kind of stuff. And that would be fine if it was linked to an argument, a case for why a generation was going to be special. For example, you're the most unionized generation. You're the most, organized generation. You've got access to certain resources that no one else had. I just think that there's a certain dishonesty in all that, and I kind of wish people had said to me, I'm not going to lie, there are things about your generation which are good, and there are things about your generation which are bad. Good, you have huge access to information technology. Right? By any measure, that is civilizational advance. Good. You have, look, I have access to a national health service still, just about, in a welfare state, still just about creaking under political attacks, that my great-grandparents' generation and my grandparents' generation, who grew up in slums, had no access to. There's also a wee bit too much doom about young people now, and we face the worst situation ever. But I wish they'd also said to me, you have no organisations to represent you. Democracy is completely hollowed out. There's going to be absolutely no one to carry your voice or a distinctive attitude about your generation or what they want. I wish that had been said to me, rather than what I see being said to the Generation Z all over again, which is, you have this great internal superpower to challenge the conservatism of the old world and you're going to overthrow it. And I just want to say to them, I'm going to be honest with you, in a lot of ways, you're quite badly fucked. You are quite...
I just think there is blindfold... I look at my... because I've got an 18 or 22, I say you're as blindfolded as I was at your age. There is no chance. You might think you're going to affect change, but you've got no legs to stand on. You don't. I say to my kids, get into the arts and be an artist, and maybe you will find your eureka moment. You're never going to find it as a career politician. You won't as a plumber. You won't, or so. It's just not there. They don't have any. They're all blindfolded, and they're overdosed on information and technology. And I actually think that's worse for them, to be honest. It's all out there. We're talking about Instagram. The kids are not interested in Instagram anymore. They're on Snapchat, and there'll be another, and TikTok. There'll be another platform for them to engage in, and it's all shite. It's all there to take up time and to do this and the meme. You all know.
I mean, I pathologically mistrust people of my own generation. I'll give you a classic example of this, right? At the end of last year, there was a great end to the year when the left won in Chile. And there were many things about that movement that were very inspiring. It came off the back of the movement to change the constitution, and you could see, you know, the long view of a long struggle. And the Latin American left is endlessly inspiring because no matter how many, you know, as we've discussed, massacres it's subjected to, and, you know, coups and all this kind of stuff, it just keeps coming back. But the one thing...
It's the will of the people, though, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, and they draw on these huge, like, these very powerful resources, cultural, traditional, and you know, they know their history and they're very powerful movements. But the one dark cloud and the silver lining of that situation was I looked at the guy who was leading the movement, Boric is that his name, and I thought, oh shit, he's my age. And in my experience, that means he's going to be a CPRAS or, frankly, an AOC or something like that, which is to say, when he's confronted by institutional power, he's going to speak very radically, and then he's going to concede on point after point after point after point. Now, I don't know if that really is in the stars of my generation. I don't want to be too fatalistic about it, but I can't help but feel that comes from a certain cultural experience. I mean, I come from a generation of people who have never seen, not in this domestic context anyway, a mass labour movement of the type that this country had 50 or 60 years ago. I don't know what kind of effect that has on people, but I can tell you that at the time of the 2016 referendum, for example, I remember saying to people, we have all the rights we have in this country, not because they were granted from the European Union, but because workers fought for it. And people would look at you like you had rainbows coming out of your ears. Workers fought for it makes no sense to the average person of my generation.
No, they think it's like bestowed by government.
The population is innate. They think that the population is like a lump and it's lying there under politics.
So I think there is a... I mean... you may dislike your generation, I dislike mine. And I mean, I think there's the... For me, when I first got involved in politics, 18, 19-year-old, and people told me that protest made no difference, that the only thing you could do was to concede in the face of power, exactly the characteristics that you describe. And I mean, I think a lot of people of my age, and I'm 41, have been told that all of our lives. You must concede at every point to power, otherwise things will end badly. And what I see with the Fridays for Future, what I see, I mean, that moment of Greta Thunberg in Glasgow with the GMB striking refuse workers and the environmental activists, I thought was an incredibly profound moment. Because you had the joining of those two struggles, and it wasn't what we would have had in the late 90s, which was you don't go near striking refuse workers because that's another struggle, and we focus only on the environment. I mean, this is why we're in a situation where the climate is in a perilous position, was because people were too busy saying you mustn't connect this struggle with any other struggle, and you've got activists of that generation who are saying, we're not going to tell the police about our protest because we think that the police are part of the problem, part of an environmental problem. Whereas historically, the Generation X people who were in Extinction Rebellion sending flowers to the police for the kind policing of these demonstrations. And I think there's a very profoundly different view of power there that I'm greatly energized by in a way that I simply am not by the historical entitlement of older generations, and I think that's...
I think what's happened with us, with our generation, I suppose, is that people started to say, oh, well, the children, the answer's all in the children. And they've been saying that now for, like, I don't know, probably since the 90s, the answer's in the children, because the adults had no answers. It's basically, that's an admission. And look, these are wicked issues. We don't know how to solve them. So we'll just go into education, we'll go into the schools. And you see so many social problems projected onto childhood, projected onto young children. And it's not because there's anything special about that generation. It's because we've lost, the adults in charge have lost control. They don't know how to solve these problems. And so they project them onto the youth, onto childhood.
It's also, and can I just make this one point really quickly? It's also because the only structures that we have in society are those for children. So we have schools, and you can go to the schools, and you can get access to people through schools. How do you get access to people of working age? You used to do it through the factory that they worked in, or the mass workplace that they worked in, and those things have all vanished. And Robert Putnam has that really interesting stuff on the move away from the mass society and into a more individualist society, and how it comes in waves. And I hadn't understood that until I read his book. There's a really fascinating thing that before the First World War, there was a wave of individualism that was then replaced with a wave of collectivism from the 1920s onwards. And I think that's a really interesting historical perspective. And I think part of the reason why we go to the children is because the children can be got at in a way where you can sit 200 of them down in an assembly and talk to them.
Yeah. I'm going to bring Maggie in, and then I'll come.
I mean, I think one of the interesting things in some of this as well is, you know, that generation doesn't look to answer the difficult questions because they don't recognise the difficult questions as difficult questions. And I think that there's been, you know, in the second half of the 20th century, for many people, not everybody, but for many people, improving quality of life and improving access to culture and improving access to difference and improving access to experiential things in a way that Zoomers now, I mean, they're precarious. They cannot afford to do the things that their parents and grandparents probably take for granted. And I think there's something very, very problematic in that expectation of continuity. And I think there has been an expectation of continuity from people who went through the boomer generation and had everything.
Yeah, you work hard, good things will happen for you. Now,
yeah,
I worked hard and good things aren't happening.
And I think there's something profoundly unjust about how we, because we're all old enough to be in what I'm using as that collective we, are not so much saying to Zoomers now, it's going to be your generation that has to solve the problems, but it's almost like we are absenting ourselves from the problem. And I find that the greatest, a huge injustice in all of this. I don't see it both either personally or as somebody who is interested in collective action and collective progress. I don't see it as an okay thing to do to absolve myself of all responsibility for some of the things that I know I have no responsibility for, but I have a responsibility in trying to fix. And I think it's making those connections between groups of people, whether they are generationally identified or not. It's about making those connections between those groups of people who share common struggle. And I think common struggle doesn't necessarily go in the same kinds of generational ways as it has done in the 20th century. And our political systems don't understand that. Our political structures don't get that. And that's what we need to be working on. How is it that we can bring people together, if not in the school assembly or in the factory? How is it that we bring people together and say, this is our common enemy? Let's coalesce around this and build something better.
Because we're encouraged to believe that these problems are actually within social divisions. So actually the reason why you don't have a house and so on is because the boomers, they hogged it. They hogged everything. So hate them. Or like because the white person does this and so on. And so we're encouraged to point fingers at each other instead of looking up.
Yeah.
I'd hate to be the only person here who loves his generation, trusts his generation. But
I'm indifferent to my generation.
what I do think is I'm not comfortable, I'm uncomfortable with certainties. I want productive, interesting, questioning, doubt. And I feel that great questions often have not been satisfactorily found answers for because actually the answer is a paradox. It's not what we expect. To my feeling, counterculture is not about exactly knowing. I mean, I remember a great slogan near Tottenham Court Road tube station where somebody had sprayed up on the wall in the 70s, mutants for nuclear power. I thought a nice satire, but what I feel about counterculture is that it makes us think again, makes us think things over, makes us want to debate and discuss. We're living in a society which, for generations now, half of all adults do not read books, period.
Half of adults read books. That's
Don't-
wonderful.
Well,
That's more than I thought.
It's much better than I
just wanted
thought.
to come to something that you had said about like young people being essentially terminally online and this information overload.
Yeah.
So I think that got really bad, particularly in the last 2 years over the pandemic. And I think everyone kind of became a bit terminally online, you know, with like the...
Look at your activity levels.
Yeah, of course. I just wanted to get a sense of, like, what are the long-term implications of this for culture, for counterculture? Like, I mean, I think that there's an argument that could say, actually, people being online and not identifying necessarily with a particular place is great because it allows cultures to infuse. Like, would we ever have heard of K-pop, for example?
Yeah.
Like, if it hadn't been for people being online, and it's a very online subculture, I would say, rather than maybe a counterculture. You know, are there upsides?
What are the upsides? They become children of the world, I guess, but I still don't think they're any more educated than someone that read a book. Sorry, I think there's too much overload. There's too much emphasis on information given at any, like you said, at any time. They have the knowledge of the world, but really they're so self-absorbed. Like, I see some of my daughter's pals. It's all about the makeup and the lippy, and they're looking exactly like how such and such looks, and I'm like, it's crazy.
Haven't teenagers always
I was
done
going to say
this?
that teenagers are typically self-absorbed and obsessed with their parents.
I don't think that's going to change, though. I think I look at the older. I mean, I look at their idols, the Kardashians or whoever these people are. I don't know them, but it's all about fillers and bum size and clothes, and it's insane. It's like it's overload.
I worry that I'm
constantly.
I don't know if you have this feeling. I worry that I'm becoming a reactionary in a very specific sense. Not in a general sense, right? We'll get on to Brexit later, but but not even in a directly. I'm trying to be more self-aware as I age, you know. Not in a directly political sense, right? In the sense that Mark Leela talks about it, who I think is a really interesting liberal intellectual in America, who says that the nature of transformative technologies means that we are now in such a rapid turnover, and the nature of reaction is you're looking back to a previous era where everything went wrong, and you want to retrace your steps back to the golden era. And he says the nature of that constant revolution of capitalist society means that there's a fresh Eden created, you know, every 10 years for people to look back to. I mean, I've already done it so far in this conversation. I've said, why isn't there a literary movement anymore? I hate it that everything's visual now. You know, so I'm already doing this. This really came home to me when I heard about the idea of the metaverse. And I realised that I was watching sort of news stories about it on BBC, and as soon as it came on, I switched it off. And I realised I'd put it off for about 4 months before I actually read about what it was, because I don't want it. I badly do not want to live in the next stage of whatever social media or the internet is or whatever. I'm terrified of it. And that has been old. That's because I'm old.
The kids are gobbling that up, but they're also gobbling it up and then throwing it away immediately.
There's an absolutely fascinating thing about this, which is that all of these things are owned with the intention of making profit. I say with the intention of making profit because Twitter doesn't seem capable of making seems capable of making a mess, but not a profit. And all of these things are driven in the ways, they reproduce the expectations of the people who own them. So it's about brand, it's about identity, it's about things that you pay for, fillers. You know, all of that really well defined. And Richard Seymour's book on Twitter, I think, is well worth a read on this. He describes how what Twitter turns you into is a celebrity. You may be a celebrity with only 20 followers, but you're a celebrity, and you're trying to cultivate yourself in that way. And I remember back to the times before social media, before you could post on the internet as yourself, when the internet was a one-directional thing, so Web 1.0. And the difference that, you know, having to create a photograph of yourself and having to present yourself in that way to the world, I think was quite profound. And that actually brings me to a point about ownership. And my question is, why is it that we let all of these things be owned by people who have that view of the world? Why is it that, I think there are only one or two really major internet companies, I think Mozilla, who run Firefox, and Wikipedia are the two big internet startups that aren't for profit. All of the others are. And we're letting Facebook determine our world. We're letting TikTok determine how our world works. And that's very closely connected to the people who run those things' perception of how the world should be.
We're not even just letting them, we're demanding that they do that. Like, we're demanding that they kick people off their platforms who say the wrong things and so on. Like, people are saying, oh, that's not censorship, because a capitalist is doing it, so it's fine. No, government's not doing it.
That's exactly the argument. Whether it's oh God, what's his name, Joe Rogan, or like any of these, or even Donald Trump, right? I was in the very invidious position when Twitter kicked Donald Trump off his Twitter account. I remember thinking, yeah, I don't like anything Trump has to say, but he's the most powerful elected politician on the earth, and he's been removed from a huge media platform at the click of someone's fingers. There was no discussion. This happened in a back room somewhere. A bunch of people who I don't even know who they are made the decision to deplatform the most powerful, the most elected, if you like, person on the earth, except for someone in India, right? And again, with this Joe Rogan thing, I'm just thinking, this is weird now. When I was growing up, the big conspiracy theory was 9/11, right? I had friends who believed it. I actually had quite a lot of friends who had like some belief in it. I didn't really believe it, but it was all over the place.
Yeah, and it was kind of a leftist thing as well.
It was kind of subversive, and people were kind of like groping towards explanations about like imperialism and geostrategy. And one of the things they'd inevitably come across was often quite confused ideas about, did Bush do 9/11 and all this kind of stuff. Now, some people giggled at it at the time. No one said, this is disinformation, it's dangerous, shut it down, take it off YouTube. I think those videos, those conspiracy theory videos are still on YouTube. How have we gotten into a situation where Neil Young is saying to a powerful corporation, I want you and I empower you to take this discussion about vaccines or something off the air? And you're absolutely right. The counterpoint is always, oh, but it's a private company. They can do what they want. I don't know when this became the socialist attitude. The richer you are and the more property you own, the more of a say you get on what the public conversation is.
But there's a more fundamental point, which is that Trump partly became famous
because of Twitter.
Because of Twitter. He played Twitter's game. So it was set up in a way that it promoted people like him. And I've done a number of experiments with Twitter, and basically you end up turning into it exposes your you.
I think you lose your intellectual self on Twitter. I think you go on there initially with your views, but eventually you get involved in so much of the discourse that you're actually lost, and your voice is lost eventually. So it becomes nothing.
Yeah.
I want to develop in this stuff about like cancel culture and culture wars. Like, I think that this is like right at the core of a lot of these discussions about like big tech. Who owns the cultural factory, right? Like, who owns cultural production now? And it does tend to be like Silicon Valley. And a lot of what we might call like countercultural or subcultural movements actively seek support from Silicon Valley and big tech. But David, it's interesting the stuff you were saying about Rogan, the Joe Rogan show, because it's Neil Young. It's Neil Young, it's Joni Mitchell, it's the heroes of the counterculture, or like that, do you know what I mean, that romantic version of the counterculture who are now pushing forward this like, cancel these episodes.
Yeah, do you know, it caused me to think again about the culture of the 1960s, because I did think to myself, like, what is the actual radical political content of a lot of that 60s counterculture? That hippie thing is like, there's a kind of an eerily organicist conservative thing going on there. The world is pure, the Earth Mother is pure, but the world of material things and people is evil.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And what we need to do is like return to a sense of wholeness and oneness with the Earth. I mean, those are very traditionally like conservative attitudes. But besides that, I did just think like, I mean, some people said to me about Joni Mitchell and Neil Young, well, they survived polio. So they have like a certain buy-in on like a health level to sing. And I thought, yeah, but that would explain to me why you don't like it that someone's an anti-vaxxer, right? That's fine. That's a totally legitimate position. If you want to say, look, I barely survived as a kid because of people, you know, and it disgusts me that people don't want to take vaccines. That's fine to say that. What's not fine to say that is, and I think that the people who decide whether you get to say that or not should be the rich people. And that seems to me to be an innovative
I think it's
new idea.
worth noting what Neil Young and Joni Mitchell actually did, which wasn't to say Joe Rogan.
They sold themselves to Amazon.
Joe Rogan. Well, no, but
They just wanted to be off the platform.
Yeah,
Joe Rogan put himself into the mainstream by signing a £100 million deal with Spotify. Joe Rogan could have happily stayed being Joe Rogan and could have said whatever he wanted, and people went, that's fine, Joe Rogan's over there. The minute you're on Spotify, you're part of the mainstream and you're going to come under whatever the mainstream decides.
It's quite curious what people get enraged by of trolling and so on. I was worried for a moment you were going to say, well, fillers work for me, but you know, as a Botox junkie, I was waiting. But Cobra, after the end of World War II, was an art movement. Didn't last very long, but it showed us what free expression, completely free, what freedom of expression, creative expression really means, and it wasn't very pretty, really ugly. Moving forward 70 years, 60 years, the internet and all that was extolled and sold to us as a freeing thing, as something democratic, because everybody would have free access and you could use it how you liked, particularly when social media are going. But that kind of freedom is not very pretty, and that's just inevitable. It has none of the professional checks and balances that we would expect of newspaper publishing, book publishing, or other things. Now, from a counterculture perspective, it would be easy to say, well, that's great. No constraints. We're all free. It's all for us. We can do with it what we like. Well, that's up to a point great, but beyond that point, it's not at all great. And it's open season for all kinds of fakery.
It's not free though, is it? I mean, like Facebook or Google, famously now, the algorithm selects the political content.
True.
So if you search on a given issue, you'll see the big kind of publisher's idea and the state's idea and so on. I mean, this in many ways is like the biggest democratic question of our era.
I agree.
Which is we're entering a profound period of censorship. It's already live. I mean, we have an antiquated idea of what censorship is, which is a guy like a grey suit in a big building stamping censored on something. It's routine now. It's algorithmic. Like we're not seeing certain opinions because they're filtered out automatically by the social media companies.
But we've always had that,
Yeah.
and I think that's you know the idea that all of a sudden we're in a censorious era. I think is to ignore.
Newspapers aren't as powerful as TikTok, though, are they? Or Twitter, or all these sorts of outlets?
I mean, I think they certainly were.
See, on the topic of cancel culture and culture wars, what I think is new is that maybe people wouldn't agree these are pragmatic issues or like pragmatic policy issues, but something like vaccines, mask wearing, have become cultural signifiers and very explicitly left-wing or right-wing. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that is new. I think that, like, so the way, for example, the truckers movement, like how that is being treated as like pure reaction, like in fact very dangerous reactionary movement.
Which is your first sign that there's something good about it.
This is your view, yeah.
Well, I don't know, like, okay, immediately the left writes it off completely because they're so used to transforming problems into something that a professional class can solve. Right, so I can administer to you this, and tell me all about it. How terrible is your suffering, and so on. And the idea that they're not asking for that they're demanding self-determination and freedom. That's like the big banner, right? That's so scary, so unruly. Immediately, it's written off entirely. And then who picks up the power? These crazy right-wing reactionary groups, right? But the thing is, I think the impulse of that movement is quite exciting, which is that I don't want to be dictated to about how I'm going to live my life. I don't want to be dictated to about what goes into my body. I don't want to be, and I think it's spread out into so many different things, this kind of like pushback. You know, they've sussed out that professional middle class. I know, you're pretending to be on my side. You're pretending to be good people, but you're not. You're not. And I'm going to take control here. And that's terrifying, I think. And I think that's part of the reason why it's been so roundly dismissed and vilified.
But I mean, I think for me, the left has always had two concepts in tension. One is freedom and one is solidarity. And
both of those are gone. It's just safety now.
And, well,
protection.
Let me work through the idea. I mean, I think that COVID has given us a crucible in which those two things have come into very direct conflict. So, in order to have solidarity with people who are vulnerable and who may be badly affected by the spread of COVID, we are asked to act in a way that is solidaristic and to give up some of our freedoms. And I think it's really interesting that, broadly speaking, people have been comfortable with that. And I think there was a really interesting moment in March 2020 where there was all of this stuff around was it fatigue, behavioural fatigue, that if people were asked to self-isolate or to have a lockdown, they would refuse. And after a period of time, they would stop obeying these rules. And I think by and large, people have decided that they preferred being safe. They preferred their health to going out to shop. And I mean, there's that moment in sort of late summer 2000 where the Tory government said you had to go to work or you'd be sacked. They sent people back to work at the DVLA in Swansea, isn't it? Which had the highest death rate of any workplace from COVID as a result of ministers forcing people back to work. The population said, no, we don't really want to do that. We want to find ways of working that work both with those solidaristic impulses and also with a degree of freedom. And I think I think people balance those much better actually than the politicians.
Yeah.
Here's a question about that.
Do you think that that's so that's not how I would understand solidarity? Like, I just think that this idea of I'm not sure that it was an impulse of solidarity, that's why people complied with the government rules. Like, I'm just not convinced.
Really interestingly, I think people started locking themselves down before the government introduced a lockdown. I remember going out to get a.
We're scared.
Yeah.
Through fear.
Well, it may be, but I think it was also about solidarity. It was about protecting people, protecting vulnerable people. And that was the social impulse. So it wasn't that people were complying with the government. It was that the government actually followed the people.
I don't think people were doing that because they were worried about vulnerable people. I think people were doing that because they were frightened. I just think that's the distinction.
Here's the question at the other end of this process, right? The public and in Britain, partly because we have an NHS, people are very used to taking vaccines. So there was a very rapid uptake of the vaccine, very comprehensive. By the time that the UK government was saying that all of the problems with the spread of the virus were being caused by anti-vaxxers, 90% of people were vaccinated. And of the remaining 10%, some of them couldn't take it. Many of them were people, they weren't ideological anti-vaxxers. They were perhaps people living in distress, living in isolation, whatever. So you have a situation where 90% of the population is vaccinated, is volunteering themselves to be vaccinated. And it's at that point that the government says all of the problems are being caused by the unvaccinated, and now we're going to introduce vaccine passports that say that you must be vaccinated to get a job, including 7% of the NHS. There's no question whatsoever that removing 7% of NHS staff would be a massive hit to the public health response to the virus. So I think that at that point you could really clear, and this is the thing, I mean, when we talk about these protests in Canada, their explicit demand is against vaccine passports. I agree with that position. I agree with the argument that says that, I understand why people want to resist state compulsion about stuff to do with their bodies. That's long been a left-wing point of view when it comes to abortion rights, when it comes to questions like imprisonment, when it comes to all kinds of things. The left has traditionally been guarded against the state's right to do with people's bodies what it wants and so on. Though I would just say this one thing, which is when I've watched interviews with the convoy protesters in Canada, for example, or in the streets of London where they've had very large protests variously against lockdown, against vaccine passports and so on. What I've found interesting is something which is characteristic of the entire political and cultural spectrum at the moment, which is all of the arguments fit within what I would broadly describe as the liberal tradition. So all of the arguments, like if you look at any debate that takes place, the arguments are always about physical autonomy. I have a right to variously decide medically what happens to me. I have a right to decide, what happens to me in terms of how I self-identify. I have a right to decide what profession I go into, what area of consumer culture I enter into, and so on. I mean, I just find it interesting in general that for all the rancor of the current political situation, we all have the exact same philosophical precepts. We all fundamentally agree on that idea of personal physical sovereignty. I don't know what that means.
I don't think we all agree on that at all. That's the thing, is that we've lost that liberal tradition. I think a large portion of the left defines itself even as anti-liberal, which is terrifying. The idea that the left is about freedom and solidarity, I think we've lost that a long, long time ago. If you talk to people, it's about safety and protecting the vulnerable, which is scary because who swoops in to promise to keep us safe? Governments that perhaps we shouldn't trust when they can stoke up fears and then promise to protect us from those fears. I think the good part of the leftist tradition was that desire for freedom and self-determination, which is at the heart of Marxism, for example, which is the idea that the whole purpose of what we are doing is to increase our freedom. For example, you go on strike not for well-being Wednesdays and a sense of fleeting mental health or well-being or whatever, but for more money and less time in the realm of necessity at work making that money. In other words, to increase the realm of freedom. That's what the purpose of those movements were, and that is gone now. That's gone. Now leftism is about protecting the vulnerable and divisions into all these small different groups and the different rights and different responsibilities that we have as part of all of these different, perhaps, warring groups. And I think that's an enormous, enormous problem, enormous, I think, move backward for progressive movements.
But
100 years ago, life expectancy in North America dropped by 12 years. Dropped. This was at the end of Spanish flu. It killed 5% of the world's population in 5 years. This one hasn't, although the jury will be out. And given the uncertainties and the potential risks, notwithstanding that central banks and others have been telling lots of organizations you've got to plan for what the impact of a pandemic might be and so forth, there was very little unpreparedness. People didn't really know, and it's in those circumstances it's very easy to get your politics and your science confused, and it's also very easy to assume that there should be a scientific answer. No, there isn't. There's partly probabilities and finger in the air and likelihoods and statistical maybes, rather than absolutely knowing.
It didn't come out of nowhere. People did know. I've been teaching medical sociology for 10, 12 years, and that's one of the very first things we teach in medical sociology. Civilization brings pandemics. We're due for a pandemic. We live very close with animals. Zoonotic diseases is where we get our colds and so on. It was well known. The UK produced pandemic preparedness plans that said they were prepared for a pandemic. They ranked, I think, first or second in the world for pandemic preparedness because someone knew how to put together a very good PowerPoint presentation. But when it actually came down to it,
there was a shit show.
Yeah, they were like, we'll pull these levers that are not attached to anything.
the plan was to buy
It was so
more body
politicised.
bags.
And every decision seems to be politicised. Why wasn't there masking stations on every corner and going, you must wear a mask?
They were burning masks.
There were.
Yeah, I know, but there was nothing was. Every decision seems to have been like, well, actually, maybe we won't wear masks. It's like, why was every decision? Why was it politicised? Why was there so much?
Because it started in China and they felt that they had to follow China's model.
But why didn't the government just say you have to wear a mask and that's it?
At
They
Summerhall,
didn't have the mask for everybody.
at Summerhall we had an exhibition about.
They did,
I
but
know.
they burned them.
But they burned them.
At Summerhall we had an exhibition about Spanish flu. It was up for about 3 years. We took it down just before.
seen it.
Just before the actual pandemic
Good timing.
You don't want to worry people.
I think that's what Paul's
100 years ago, thousands of people wore masks, and nurses died like flies, and doctors and so forth. It was awful. the impact on the world, or our world, but also the world generally, was pretty phenomenal. But historians haven't really been able to get to grips with it. They think it's the demographic hit of World War I. No, it's the demographic hit also of Spanish flu. And people date whole counterculture, modernism, contemporary, whatever you want to call it, from sort of then. And I can see quite a lot of signs of something quite frenetic and dynamic and active coming out of the sausage that we're in at the moment.
I wanted to bring this back round to like the culture war more generally. Partly in a reflection of like what's being said about, you know, people potentially giving up freedoms in order to protect the most vulnerable, and is that the kind of the priority for society at that point? So I mean, moving beyond the pandemic, is the culture war, like, regardless of what the issue is, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's about gender, whether it's any other type of issue, do you think this is pure motives that have gone wrong? Or do you think the whole thing is entirely cynical?
Right. I think there's a really the current Tory government that we've got are governing on the basis of a mandate they got to deliver Brexit, which they claim to have done, and I think they have to find other ways in which to build bases of support. And I found it absolutely fascinating that they decided to indulge themselves in a bit of culture war over the football last summer.
Yeah.
Where they made this big thing about how inappropriate it was for English footballers to take the knee. And you had Boris Johnson saying they shouldn't do it. You had Priti Patel saying they shouldn't do it. And then they played the England footballers who are probably not the team that the Tories would want to have. Young, mixed race, some of them engaged in progressive politics, played really well, and everybody liked them. And fascinatingly, that sort of culture war about how taking the knee was divisive and was about dividing people, was part of the woke. I'm still not really sure why that's an insult, but let's leave that aside. The moment that they played well, the moment that people got engaged with that football team, was the moment at which the Tories shut up about taking the knee and how Black Lives Matter had gone too far and how it was divisive and dividing people. And I thought there was a really interesting thing there, which was that there will be a culture war for as long as moneyed interests need to retain power, because they'll always press the button on those issues. They pressed the button on lesbian and gay lives in the 1980s, and yesterday was the 35th anniversary of Mark Ashton's death. And if you haven't seen the film Pride, you should definitely go and see the film Pride about lesbians and gays support the minors. A man who reached out across cultural divides to build solidarity. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. You know, I mean, Section 28 and all of that Tory, all those Tory attacks on gay people in the 1980s were overcome when people said, no, we don't agree with you on this, and we're not going to pander to you. And, you know, I mean, there were really significant voices in the Labour Party saying, no, we need to pander on homophobia because people don't like gay people, and if we want to get into power, we need to be a bit homophobic. And the moment at which they stood up and said, no, this doesn't go any further, was the moment at which public attitudes completely changed. And
I mean,
I feel like there's a sense in which, like, I mean, I said at the start of this whole conversation, I said I thought that social conservatism started to die in about some point in World War I, right, in the sense of betrayal. The 1980s were famously a period of revival for a certain type of social conservatism, thinner, with less public appeal, but attached to a concept of national revival. Reagan used it with the minority movement in the 1980s. Thatcher used it by adopting some of the language of the National Front and so on, about being swamped by immigrants. And so there was a certain limited revival, and Section 28 was certainly part of that. I think the difference now is, and I think these are the fundamental preconditions for what we call the culture war, whatever you want to think that is. One is the total hegemony of liberalism. Right, and this is the point I was sort of trying to make about, like, whether it's right-wing liberalism or left-wing liberalism, those are your options. Social democracy and conservatism are dead, effectively, as social forces. People talk a lot about the decline of Marxism as a revolutionary credos, but in many ways the much more catastrophic decline is social democracy, because what you've seen is a disappearance of a retreat of the working class movement, and with it the idea of an alternative to capitalism. Also, the idea of a conservative alternative to capitalism has also completely disappeared. I mean, one of its last great spokespersons was Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, who disastrously sided with Thatcher's project in the 1980s and lived, I think, probably to regret it, because the marketisation of every aspect of society undermined the things that he held dear, religious institutions, the family, and so on. We're now left with a situation where you have a right-wing liberalism and a left-wing liberalism, and the culture war takes place almost entirely within the tiny loop and shrinking loop of that political perspective, in a situation where the working class majority has retreated from politics and the middle class is hyper-politicised. My overwhelming feeling...
Can you just be specific about how that manifests in somewhere like Scotland?
Well, I mean, Scotland's almost the arch example, because we have 5 political parties in the parliament and they're all liberal. I mean, you have the Tories are kind of like a right liberal party, the Lib Dems are kind of centre liberal, and then the 3 left-wing parties, Labour, SNP, and the Greens are all, as I would see it,
worth saying that
left
the leader of the Scottish Tories.
Are the SNP liberal?
Oh, definitely.
I'm just thinking about like the. I mean, some people would say like the interventions of the SNP into family matters or household matters.
Liberalism
like
is an authoritarian creed.
Like hate speech.
I think
This would be neoliberal.
Yeah, I mean, this is a mistake of language, though. But I mean, if you look at like the founding fathers of liberalism, I mean, people like Calhoun in America in the mid 1800s, he was an authoritarian liberal. He was a pro-slavery liberal, right? Liberalism is an authoritarian political creed. I think sometimes the language causes problems. Liberalism is the dominant idea of metropolitan capitalism, fundamentally, and it's a very flexible and powerful ideology. It acts in our society as opposition and rule and opposition to rule. It's a very powerful position to be in. But social conservatism as such and socialism as such have retreated, and that's what we call the culture war. See during the England Cup final, I remember I had a very mixed feeling about it, which was, one, I was glad that the Tories were getting telt for their cynical manipulation of the culture war tropes, which at other times I've felt annoyed at the left for manipulating those tropes. But the other feeling I had the very next day was the boot's on this foot right now and the Tories are getting a kicking. Tomorrow, the boot's on the other foot. Because my general experience of the culture war is it comes back around to someone like Trump. And the people on the right of the political spectrum will ultimately be in the best position to wield it. Yes, there are short-run victories for liberal leftism, for example, but ultimately it's a terrible bind for the left to be in, to be attached to this cyclical culture where we're constantly, the pendulum swings back and forth over these issues, and ultimately what's always going on in the background is the working class majority of the population are receding and receding and receding from view, and that's what keeps the pendulum swinging.
But should some views be cancelled?
Well,
are there some views that like actually, because like I mean, growing up in anyone who grew up in like the 80s, like where there was like an organised right-wing movement on the streets, would have a sort of policy of no platform, for example, right? So, like, are there some views that should be cancelled from society, or do we have a consensus that?
I mean, no platform is not cancelling something from society.
There's something.
Sure, but you get the parallel that I'm drawing.
There's something.
Are there some views that are so abhorrent or so dangerous that they should not be aired in public?
There's something oxymoronic about this. Culture war. Culture is about peaceful and about politics. It's not about war.
So you say, should some ideas be cancelled? I would say no, because it comes down to what you believe about human beings. Do you think human beings are capable of making judgments? Then you should be allowed to say things, because first of all, the best disinfectant is sunlight. But also, the best combat against misinformation is more information, more debate about things. If you don't believe that human beings are capable of making judgments, then you don't believe in democracy. And I think that's a very, very scary path to tread. I think to cancel ideas is treating citizens like children. And you cannot have a progressive movement if your base of society is children.
So,
if you don't believe in the people who are supposed to follow you.
I think we have to be quite precise about what we're talking about here. And I think the cancellation of ideas, cancellation of people, it has a shifting meaning. I don't think many ideas have been cancelled. I think ideas have been contested. And all too often, ideas being contested, particularly by progressive forces, is described as cancelling those ideas. So actually, in a case with Roger Scruton, where he, after he died, there were a number of pieces saying it was terrible that he was cancelled because people turned up to protest when he would speak on campus. Now, he hasn't been cancelled. What's happened is that some people have disagreed with him. And there's this argument that cancel culture is the act of disagreeing with someone is to cancel them. It's absolutely not.
It's not just disagreement. It's trying to get people fired. Every time I say something online that people don't like, they start hunting through my history, looking for something that I've said. They at the university in. It's like they're terrorists. You know, they're like, hey, nice job you got there. It'd be a shame if someone called you racist. You know, it is a very specific and targeted campaign to delete people from public life. And they know that within capitalism, you have to work to get your means of subsistence. And so it's just like, it's very medieval, this desire to delete people. Oh, right, well, we can't make you, disappear, but we can make you disappear from gainful employment. We can make sure that you just drive trucks. And that's literally happened. Literally, a novelist.
But that's about the approach of institutions. It's not about the approach of individuals.
An example of someone who I think has been more or less cancelled from public life, and it's Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think that was a contested idea. I think that was a whole construct that was built against someone who was making challenges to the establishment, and I think he was cancelled for it. Like, this is what I'm talking about, is like, this was seen to be like a dangerous idea that needs to be stamped out at any cost. And you can think that's Corbyn, or you can think that's, the rise of anti-Semitism, there was whatever, right? But like, that's what I mean, is like, certain people are cancelled. I'm not sure that that's contesting ideas. I think that is, because I think the right is as guilty as this, as the left is guilty of this. I think everybody is kind of bought into it in some way.
See, this thing about protesting personalities, I think that this is a kind of strange new departure as well, though. I agree, ultimately I'd like to protect people's right to protest, even if that means but I don't understand where the impulse has come from to protest against personalities. So Roger Scruton is not someone I would ever protest against. I mean, when I went to university, I went to Strathclyde Business School, which is famously dominated by very neoliberal, right-wing neoliberal economists. I hated everything they said to me. But the idea of protesting against them would have been very strange to me. They were my teachers, and I disagreed with them, and I argued with them. By the way, they were some of the most fruitful relationships I ever had with any academic, because they forced me to get better at arguing with them. But whether it's Jeremy Corbyn, who did see protests over like the trumped up idea that he was an anti-Semite, or Roger Scruton, who is one of the very last holdouts of a genuine social conservative position in Britain, and you'd have to say he wasn't a threat to public order in any kind of way. I think the Salisbury Review, his magazine, had about a circulation of about 10,000 people. Or is that Kathleen Stock, like that, the recent protests against her on her campus, for example, the fact that it was so personified to an individual, to me, was strange. Disagree with the ideas, debate the ideas, argue about the ideas, but it does seem to me a kind of strange turn in a way. And I know this is partly a campus culture, but it does have a wider echo in society of protesting specific individuals, their names, their faces. That, to me, that is like a degradation of politics. That's not what the object of protest specifically should be. It should be government, states, corporations, companies, policies. That should be the object of protest. And I wonder where this hyper-personification of protest has come from.
But I mean, I think that's a question about political tactics. And I think the question about, and I mean, I agree with a lot of what you say about Jeremy Corbyn, but I think it's interesting that if you're on the left, you're not cancelled. You've just vanished from public life. And I mean, I had a friend who sadly died, Dawn Foster, who was a journalist who wrote for The Guardian. And she wrote an article about how Tom Watson had to either get with Corbyn or go as deputy leader. And she was sacked by The Guardian for that. Now, I didn't see any concern about cancel culture. When Suzanne Moore, another Guardian journalist, chose to leave because other staff didn't agree with her position on the trans issue, there was a massive effusion of horror about how she'd been cancelled. Now, without getting into the specifics of either of those, it kind of feels to me like cancel culture is an accusation made by the right against the left when the left contest their
lot of
ideas.
these people are not right wing. That's the thing. It's like left wing. It's like that meme. Left wing is love and hope, and everything else is right wing. Like you disagree with these little tenets, you're right wing. I get called right wing. I'm a flaming Marxist. I get called right wing because I don't believe in like decolonization theory and things like that. That's the thing. You just smear somebody as right wing and then it's fine. But if you're left wing, well, maybe it's all right.
But I mean, the specific example of Jeremy Corbyn, the reason why it's not cancel culture is because, and I mean, I think it's fair to say Jeremy Corbyn was on the left, and most of those trying to cancel him were on the right, or certainly were to his right. And I think that they did exactly the sorts of things you were talking about. I mean, they got him removed from his job. But there was no outcry about that being cancel culture.
The question for us on the left, though, needs to be, should we have a very consistent position? You know what I mean? Like, Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, the campaign against him of the allegations of anti-Semitism was one of the most bizarre kind of McCarthyite turns I've ever seen take place. And I remember thinking this is deeply democratically unhealthy for everyone to be involved in what I considered a gross collective lie that everyone knew was a lie. But then, you know, we need to maintain a certain standard. I mean, I think there's just, I mean, when it comes to university campuses, to me, they should be the places where you can have the widest expression of debate. And even, I mean, we'll maybe get onto this, but it's like this idea that in many ways they need to be the most controlled spaces of intellectual debate seems to be a bizarre American importation of these like campus wars that ought to be really alien to the culture of university campuses. But you know, it's almost like the very places that were traditionally the spaces where the most democratic expression took place, university campuses and the media, are supposed to be these great fora.
So I think the question has to be about the tactics that are being used. And I mean, those protests against Roger Scruton happened in the early 2000s because of his position in homosexuality. So he was a homophobe, I think it's fair to say, and he was being the subject of protests because of his homophobia, and I think a support of Section 28 retention and those sorts of things. Now, we can have a debate about whether those are the right tactics. We can have a debate around whether the tactics that have been used in other circumstances, and obviously I don't agree with them in the circumstances you outline are the right ones. But I think the trope of cancel culture is a right-wing idea, which is about how if you say things like Boris Johnson says about Muslim women looking like post boxes, or all of his other racist and homophobic slurs. I mean, that horrific thing he wrote about.
But you never get cancelled for that.
Tank top bum boy.
You can't be cancelled if you're powerful. The whole point of cancel culture is, call it what you will, is that it targets people who are further down the spectrum. I'll give you a perfect example of this. I was working as a journalist during the time of the anti-Semitism witch hunt in the Labour Party. I submitted a dossier of high-ranking Labour Party members, of course, all the way going up to Tony Blair, of people who had made brazenly Islamophobic statements in the run-up to the Iraq War and afterwards and during the War on Terror. Now, I submitted this document to the disciplinary process in the Labour Party, and some of the stuff was so extreme, there's no way it could have been interpreted as anything else than bigotry. And I kept phoning them and they kept ignoring me, because they had the power to do it. These sorts of attacks only hone in on people who lack the social power to defend themselves, which is why, I mean, and you know, like academics, yeah, they have somewhat more power than your average person in the street, but compared to state power or corporate power, it's absolutely nothing. They're easy pickings, and I think that's often why we have protest movements that go for an easy target. A lone academic or media worker is a relatively easy target compared to the enormity of state power. And that's partly where this has come from. It's come from our own sense of powerlessness. It's come from our own lack of belief in our ability to change the world. I can't change state policy, but I can shut your mouth.
Yes, yes.
And that's what I'm going to do.
Also, it tends to happen in these areas of these professions where people are really just jostling to get in. So it's very difficult to become an academic. It's very hard to get in. And so a lot of academics will get cancelled because it's like, I'm going to get in there, and if I got to climb up over dead bodies, that's what I'm going to do. A lot of writers will get cancelled. A lot of comedians will get cancelled. There are far more writers and comedians than there are the ones that we actually see on television and so on. I think there's also an element of class interest among the professional class where they are precarious. And they're
so few jobs, so many.
And they're constantly getting
people.
tossed down into the working class, and so they start backbiting and infighting.
Can I just, I wanted to, sorry, Robert, just to move this on a bit. Otherwise we will be here all night. To get into like our last subsection of the discussion, which is on national culture. Obviously we're recording this in Edinburgh tonight, so I'm sure Scotland will feature on the agenda somewhat. And it was something you said, David, about the importation of this American style of, you know, controlled spaces within universities. Do people think that national culture still matters, still has relevance in an increasingly globalized, or maybe I mean Americanized world? Like, what is the significance and importance of national culture? Because I think when sometimes you say national culture, people get a bit like, oh, that sounds reactionary. Do you know what I mean? It sounds dangerous. It sounds like, you know, the British National Party or whatever. But like, I mean, national culture is surely important because that's where you start to, this where one of the fundamental building blocks of society, isn't it?
The answer to your question is very simple. Nationalistic culture is awful, terrible. We can't be doing it. We've got to get rid of it. But if we get rid of it, it'll be even worse. We need.
It doesn't sound simple.
You have to have both. You have to have a balance. You can't not have it, and yet you can't. You can't be doing with it entirely. You can't believe in the totality of Scottish arts or Scottish culture, but at the same time, you've got to take cognizance of what comes from Scotland, or is happening in Scotland, or is happening in Edinburgh, happening in Glasgow. So it's just a question of being sensible and having a balance. It's not a question of some absolute definition of right or wrong.
Yeah. I mean, what I think is at the moment quite interesting about Scottish culture, maybe you'll disagree with me, maybe you'll all disagree with me on this, right? Is that at one point I think that Scotland had a very subversive, non-conformist culture around things like literature, right? So you had like James Kelman, you had Irvine Welsh, right? So you had like these very provocative, you had people like Archie Hind, you had Alistair Gray, very like provocative, predominantly like working class, literary figures, artists, and like, see, since devolution, I get the sense that there's like a degree of self-satisfaction in Scotland. I don't see like a reflection or a self-criticism of our culture. I don't know, I just don't think that these types of literary figures, or we don't have that sort of movement anymore.
Have we had a single reflection on the independence referendum?
Well, I mean, there's never been this is, I suppose what I mean is like there's no TV programme about the independence referendum. There's no drama about the independence referendum.
Too divisive.
So do you know what I mean? Like when you look at the output of like BBC dramas, the most dramatic thing to happen in modern Scottish history is a referendum on independence. And no, it doesn't seem to be part of...
Well, there's a reason
history
for
already.
this.
It's history already.
Yeah.
There's a reason for this. I know several very famous, well-kent writers, and I'm not going to name names, and I know what they think about Scottish independence, the referendum, but they're not going to say in public what they think. A lot of writers won't.
Why?
Because
it might alienate some of their readership, and it might get them into having to debate things that they sort of don't feel it's key to their work. Before the referendum, I co-sponsored a debate at the National Library which had 6 Irish writers meeting 6 Scottish writers in front of 100 people. And the debate was very interesting because the Scottish writers will say, well, I've been to England, I've been to London, you know, they don't understand Scotland, they don't get me. That's why we need independence. And the Irish writers were saying, hang on a minute, you want to think about this a bit more. You know, and the Scottish writers were talking about London and England like a disappointed child talks about their parents, my mummy and my daddy, they don't understand me. Well, London doesn't understand Cornwall, Lancashire, Yorkshire. Why should it understand Scotland? In fact, London, a lot of true Londoners are proud not to get other places. So what? There's a lot of emotion, a lot of going with the heart. Now, that said, I also did a survey of about 200 artists across all the arts. And the ones who are most for independence tended to be the poets, some folk singers, not orchestral musicians, not visual artists, not most novelists. Who have I missed out? Dancers, absolutely not. Theatre people who, no.
But I suppose one of the questions that I would think worth interrogating off the back of that information is, why is it that there are these divides within cultural spheres? And I think you talk about a national culture, I'm not sure, I don't know that I see it as problematic. I just don't think I can understand how it's defined. Because, I mean, even within Scotland, there is so much diversity and there is so much variation and there is so much antagonism between different groupings, either geographically located or media or thematically located. And I think, you know, there is not one Scotland, there is not one Scottish culture. I think that there are the dominant cultures that get played out in mainstream media, in social media, in literature, in those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean to say that that epitomises and defines Scottish culture as a national culture. And I think Scottish culture can be a whole haphazard collection of a whole range of different things that don't all sit nicely together, don't all mesh and fit around each other, and might actually come into direct conflict with each other, but that's okay. That can still be part of the Scottish culture. Would I call it a national culture? I'm not sure I would.
And yet, if you asked anyone in at least the Western world, Scottish national culture would be one of the most identifiable. You know what I mean? Of the Anglophone countries anyway. I mean, people would talk about, this is the thing, I mean, it would be a very like artificial thing, kilts and Braveheart and William Wallace and Haggis and
maybe I don't see that as culture.
exactly. Well, this is the thing. I mean, this was
sort of throwaway culture. That's
yeah.
Kind of,
It's
yeah.
commodification.
And real people in Scotland are not interested in that.
Absolutely, but this was Tom Nairn's argument. Tom Nairn, who was the famous kind of like theorist of Scottish national development, like a Marxist theorist of Scottish national development, he said, "How have we ended up with this sort of castrated culture, which is so thin and plastic and rubbish and useless, and it's so unexpressive of who we are?" And his argument has something to do with the Union and how Scotland developed in a strange relationship with its English neighbour and so on. But my feeling about contemporary Scotland is, because we have such a weak culture, we're incredibly open, and I don't mean don't get me wrong, I don't mean Summer House. I don't mean your art gallery. I mean as a national culture, we're so.
But what do you mean by national?
We don't.
We're so.
Glasgow and Edinburgh, the second cities of culture in the UK after London by far.
Yeah,
partly because they're furthest away
I'm
from
not sure
London.
that's a measure necessarily of culture.
okay.
But what do you mean by national culture?
I'll compare us to the country next door. Ireland, we don't have a writer like Joyce, right? We don't have a modern literary culture like Ireland had. So I think that's what Nairn was talking about.
Who has like
Ireland.
The only other country that comes close
Nowhere
to
else
Ireland.
has a writer.
Yes.
That's the point.
Oh yeah, we see now.
The only country
That's national culture. Someone is willing to fight
The
for
only
it, yeah.
country that comes close to Ireland in terms of numbers of Nobel Prize winners for literature and poetry is Sicily. That's
Well,
not even a national country, that's just a region.
I accept Nairn's thesis on this level. We do have, in my view, a relatively thin, rootless, cringe-worthy sort of culture, but it's left us wide open, partly because we're an English-speaking nature to Americanization. I feel like we have adopted very aggressively, since devolution in particular, like a very Californiized view of ourselves. To give one very specific example, and it's a niche one, I feel that the language movement in Scotland is very Americanized, whether it's Scots or whether it's Gaelic. I see it being associated, Gaelic. I see it being very associated with, it feels foreign to me. And maybe that's because I'm Anglophone, but I don't think it is. I think it's because I'm Scottish in a modern national sense. And I feel like it's a carrier for kind of American social liberalism, American cultural tropes about identity and culture. That's my feeling. Like I'm not saying that I can't be one round on that, but I feel like that Scottish culture has almost become a carrier for American culture, and I wonder if it's the same with many national cultures.
I mean,
It may be, sorry,
right.
it may be because there are more tracts and more publications in Gaelic and Gaelic sold in California than in Ireland and Scotland.
I didn't know that, but it's...
Right, there you go. But I also take issue very much with the idea that Scottish culture, writing, whatever, or Irish has been colonialized and weak and whatever. No, it's punched way above its weight for all of the last 200 years, basically. So I don't recognize the idea that there's something terribly debasing has been going on. And also, whatever they're doing at home in Scotland and Ireland isn't just it. They are also out and about elsewhere, and they're also in London.
But see, I've never really considered London to be a cultural capital. So I think that even in the last 3-4 decades, the most interesting cultural movements came from what could be termed peripheral Britain. Yeah. Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Northern Seoul. Do you know what I mean? Places like Wigan, Preston. So, I mean, I think that
there's a lot of truth in that. The great artists in music, art, culture, whatever, writing and dance and so forth, they often become great because they leave home. They leave the provinces. They go to London or some big city where their parents, their friends, people who know them aren't looking over their shoulder and telling them, no, don't do that. This is that's shaming. You can be shameless when you leave home and go somewhere far away.
Pogues became more Irish because they went to London.
Yeah, absolutely.
what's your take on this?
I think in the end, if you're in the arts, you always end up living in London at some point. You end up gravitating towards there because that is the great cultural capital or one of the great cultural capitals of the world. But inevitably, they start in the smaller environs, whether it's, like you say, Manchester, Liverpool, all the great artists, musicians. They've all started off as working class kids, most of them, and they've come from Nowheresville, and they end up buying that big house in London.
In Scotland,
most of them, they might move out as they get older and decide to go back down to Brighton or back to Ireland or back to Edinburgh. But the quest is always to get big and to get to London.
But you also you mentioned class as well, which I think maybe that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying national culture. Is I'm actually talking about maybe it's national counterculture I'm talking about. Like maybe this is a full circle thing, because what I mean by the cultural moment in Scotland of say the 1980s is very anti-Thatcher. So all of those writers that I've mentioned are predominantly anti-Thatcher, and then see when you come up to the modern day in Scotland, we have, for all its flaws, right, the independence referendum in 2014 has a complete anti-establishment character. Where is there an anti-establishment cultural output in Scotland? I need an example of something that captures the national imagination of people in Scotland that is profoundly anti-establishment. I
had this experience where I did TEDx Glasgow and I did a panel with Loki, and professionally I work in policy. And
why don't you describe Loki?
So Darren Mccarvey is a Scottish rapper who's moved into social criticism. And he's written a couple of books, one I think that's just out now, one called Poverty Safari, which I thought was a very stimulating book. And one of the things you learn when you do policy is you have to translate it so that people can understand what you're talking about. I was sitting next to him and he was talking like a policy officer. And there was this crowd of people, it must have been about 400 people, all cheering and whooping everything he said. It was absolutely extraordinary. You know, he was talking about the educational attainment gap. And I was thinking, this is something I would never go out and talk about in that way in front of a public audience. And he was able to engage people with that. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that and I think it's easy to see things when you look back at them. So it's easy to see what was significant in the 1980s. But it's sometimes difficult to see that when it's in front of you. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that won't turn out to be terribly significant. But I do think that it can be difficult to see it at the time. But I think what he's writing, what he's doing is really interesting, and is actually very critical of a lot of the more self-satisfied elements of Scottish exceptionalism.
I think people only want to hear from national cultures when it fits into some predefined framework, something that people recognize or can make into something not too transgressive. So obviously I can't speak too much to Scottish culture, but I know like I'm Ojibwe, obviously like half. And I noticed like there are a few controversies that have happened in the last few years with white people pretending to be Indigenous. I'm not sure if you've heard these stories, but there was
Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah. Well, no, and there was this woman in Canada who'd been taking like scholarships and grants and so on. I think she probably truly believed she was Métis or something, which is a mix of like European and Indigenous, like way back. Anyways, and what's interesting is I listened to some podcasts from this woman, and it really boiled my blood because I was thinking like me and my family, sometimes we feel like frauds. Because people talk, only time you want to hear from Indigenous people is when you got a feather and you're wafting smoke around and you're dancing and you've got beautiful clothes on and all these things, and you're talking about the suffering and the horrors and the sexual abuse and the terrible abuse. And people, oh yeah, tell me more. Tell me about how you were victimized. Tell me, shed a tear. Trudeau, bring in the close-up so I can shed a tear. And so we felt like frauds because we were like, yeah, not
That's
really
not
my
my
experience. I had a pretty good time, gotta say. Love going to the reserve. It's good times, yeah. It's like I go to the reserve, I'm like, yeah, people say crazy things. I'm right, that's me. And like, it's a good time for us, but they only want to hear the atrocity tale. They only want to hear so this is exactly the story this woman is telling. She's like, oh yeah, and the sex abuse. Let me tell you about the sex abuse. And I was just like, yeah, just paint us all as a bunch of sick. And she's like, oh, and I've got PTSD. All Indigenous people have PTSD. Just everybody's a victim. That's a story that wants to be heard. Whereas right now, with those truckers, loads of Indigenous people there. Nobody wants to hear about that. Loads of Indigenous people that are pro-pipeline because we want a better life just like anybody else. And that's what happens with national culture, is that we're encouraged to think that we are different and that it's our differences that make us who we are, instead of the fact that we want something that's the same and that actually you have a huge amount in common with other people regardless of where you are, because you want something better for yourself. You want a better life, you want more, you want better. And that's the thing that people, you want control over the economy, you want self-determination. Shh. Don't you just want to dance for us?
There's a
Brilliant thing. Can I just speak to this question also of the exceptionalism, which you actually approached in another way very well. In Scotland, upfront money for the arts, 85% of it comes from one way or another from government, including the Arts Council, Creative Scotland. Only 15% from private individuals, companies and foundations. Officially, according to the statistics, 40% of people who work in the arts are not artists, they're administrators, managers. This is a degree of managerialism which is 4 times worse than the NHS. And it's only happened since the 1980s when the government said, the arts are always needing money, they can't be very good at managing money, and asked Goldsmiths College to start a course in arts administration. And universities being like sheep, when one does it, everybody does it. And soon we were generating thousands of arts administrators. And parents were saying, oh, yes, my little so-and-so is in the arts. That's really lovely. But, she's a manager. She's not playing the piano or dancing or doing anything difficult. And so now, of all the money that goes into the arts, half of it is actually going, whether it's private or public, is going to pay the wages and salaries of arts administrators. And only 1/4 of it is actually going into the making of art.
I think
of
that,
any
this
kind.
is a really interesting thing. So like that sort
That's
of
killing counterculture, if anything is.
forgive me for this sort of like sepia tone nostalgia that I'm doing for like a particular moment in Scotland in the 1980s culturally, right? But stick with me. So when I think that this is part of the problem with like the fallout of something like austerity or the rollback of the welfare state is that people don't have these opportunities to really discover themselves as an artist or a creative. And what's happened instead, and I'm not making an argument here against public funding of the arts.
No, I'm all for it, but I don't take any. I don't take any grants from the government.
Of the money for arts is coming from the government. What impact does that have on anti-establishment arts? Like, I think it must have some. If you're relying on government funding for, your artistic projects directly, rather than like a general universal social safety net, doesn't it curtail the idea of like being anti-establishment?
Yeah, and also you have to start saying,
criticising the
I'm going to
government?
solve these problems, so give me the money. You start instrumentalizing yourself.
Yeah.
The money does go to support large groups, orchestras, certain drama groups, and so on. But for the great majority of individual artists, they are self-employed. They're not getting support. They may get some benefits indirectly because a venue, a theatre, an art gallery, a concert hall gets a grant, but they're not getting the money. And the production, the show which is being produced, may get a little bit or may not get any, or may be relying on the bank of mum and dad and friends. And,
But if you think about cultural production in a country like Scotland in particular, and I know Scotland's a special example because we're a devolved nation without our own special tax base and so on. But I mean, in this country, over the last 2 years, partly because of the pandemic, but I suspect it will be a continuing situation, all the major newspapers were funded by the government. There was a period where every major newspaper was taking subsidies from the government. The NGO sector is
How were they getting subsidies from the government?
Through enormous tax breaks, but also through the government advertising its various public messaging
Which they've
through the
taken away.
newspapers.
They've taken away the advertising.
They've taken that away, but look, you had a situation there where in a period of national crisis, all the newspapers were basically being run by the state financially, right? And then every NGO is run by the state. There's a very close relationship between the academic institutions and the state. The arts body that's all state money and so on. Anyone who thinks that isn't throwing a big wet blanket over national culture is kidding themselves. And that has to be part of the reason why we've not seen major reflection on a situation like the Scottish independence referendum. Imagine had it either been critical of that process or supportive of the referendum. Either way, the Scottish government, who's bankrolling that cultural production, looks ridiculous.
So I think there's...
I'm just going to pause there and say, like, everyone gets one last point, right? So this is your final point. We'll do one round and then people will have trains to catch, I'm sure.
So I think there's another important point here, which is that in the 1980s, as I understand it, it's a bit before my time, a lot of artists were on the Young Enterprise scheme, where the government paid you to set up your own company, and they were able to set up as comedians or were you on it? Yeah. And I think one of the really major things is much less the directed support that government gives through Creative Scotland or in other parts of the UK, the arts councils. It's the fact that people are pushed into work because there's no social safety net and therefore are unable to develop their practice as creatives. And I've done a lot of work in universal basic income, and one of the really interesting things about that is that the clearest support you get is from artists, because they say that would have given me the opportunity to develop my practice to the point where it was able to enjoy popular support. And the effect of not having that, and we see it really clearly, I think, in music, is that the people who are coming through as big artists now have all been to private school. I mean, it's
100%.
It's another part of the world, but you see the same in sport, where you have to go and work in a normally a precarious job that prevents you from developing your creativity, and it's that state support that I think, which didn't come with any assessment of artistic quality. that it's the removal of that state support and that breathing space for people that I think has been absolutely decisive. And so it's not so much national culture or the failings of Creative Scotland. It's austerity that's really strangling creativity, and that for me is the really important point here. And I think we need to look at ways in which to reverse that, so that we can get people in a position where they can develop their practice, develop their creativity, and make the huge contributions to the world that so many people who came through those schemes did.
I think you wind up with like a division between this sort of like creative class and this class that gets its means of subsistence, its ability to its money basically, through basically getting capitalists to fund them through philanthropy, or states through grants. And what winds up happening is you get a division between those people and the masses, because their interest is completely different. And often in order to get that money, they have to say, oh, I'm going to solve these problems. I'm going to do this and that. You should give me this money because you've got this agenda. Well, I fit into this agenda, and they have to mold themselves.
You have to tick the boxes.
Yeah, and then you wind up, it becomes this class against these other people where in order to maintain their existence, they have to subjugate or turn the working class into a bunch of objects, into so many problems to be solved. And of course, the working classes know exactly what's going on, and they hate it. They hate being referred to as objects, as so many problems. And this is, I think, part of the economic basis of the culture war at the moment. There's a whole class of people whose job it is to create problems they promise to solve, and a whole class of people who are actually funding them to solve their own problems that are caused by exploitation. It's madness.
Billy?
I can only say about sort of Creative Scotland. Creative Scotland's for the highbrow. It's not for the lowbrow. It's not for the working class lads that are sitting in so many rehearsal rooms night after night, or they're in their bedrooms. They're not applying for state-funded grants.
And it's against them too, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, and you need all the buzzwords. I mean, have you seen the application form to get a grant from Creative Scotland? It's a joke.
Yeah.
It's a joke. And the ones that manage to navigate through that are the ones that have either had a hand or they're highbrow artists. If you're working class, to get on the first rung of the ladder, you need talent, masses of talent, and that's God-given. And if you don't have that, you're never getting above the parapet. You're never getting above the parapet, ever.
And even if you do, you might not.
And even if you do, and somebody takes a punt on you, that's a massive punt, and they might lose their jobs for taking the punt.
Yeah.
David, good luck to them.
Final thoughts?
Oh God. Now it comes to the crunch. No, I mean, I take that. I mean, to me, Scotland, I would hate it if I had an artistic temperament in this country, because it seems like, no offence to Summer House, which I understand, Summer Hall, which has many wonderful exhibitions. It does feel like a closed circuit. And I mentioned the areas that I did because that's what kind of affects me. Like the ideological strictures, the ideological suffocation of Scottish society is extremely apparent to me. I mean, we have, as I said, a parliamentary politics completely dominated by various subspecies of liberalism, a media by a single species of establishment liberalism, and an artistic and cultural world which, wonderful exceptions aside, similarly. And I think, and that's as someone who's in like the disintegrating middle class looking at it. I think if you were locked out of that loop on an even more profound level, as you say, recording music in your bedroom or something, or trying to write in your bedroom or whatever, it must seem like an impossible mountain to scale from that perspective. I don't entirely know what the solution is, but the point I think Kat keeps raising is an important one. This self-satisfaction we have that Scotland is like a land of artists and creative thinkers and so on. Prove it in policy. If you want it to be that, make it. But there's this enormous self-belief born of the smugness of our kind of elite, of the elite sections of our society, that we've already achieved this greatness and we are an example to the world. We're nowhere near that. Scotland is a flagging democracy and a flagging cultural sphere, and we need to wake up to that. Before, by the way, there's some kind of serious backlash. The centre-left in this country has been extremely strong for the last 20 years since devolution. Don't think it can go on forever. It can't last forever. No class society which is suppressing these painful contradictions can hold them down forever. Sooner or later, something's going to go badly wrong, at which point everyone will say they saw it coming. But right now, I'm seeing a huge smugness. And it's a very similar smugness to what you had like under Obama and stuff. America's turned a corner. We're a new type of country. People think Scotland's a new type of country. I think, let's see.
But we still have all the old social problems, don't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. When it comes to the Arts Council, they give 60% of their 80 million to about a dozen venues. There are another 1,700 grants approximately a year. They don't give a shit about them. They're the ones that you think you're talking about.
Yeah.
And 500 quid, 1,500, sums which really don't matter. The conversation between, as you were alluding in a way, between artists and grant givers is between members of the same mafia. The art mafia, or the arts mafia, is worse than the genuine Italian or American-Italian mafia. Why? Because at least the American-Italian mafia know that they're a fucking mafia, whereas this lot don't. They pretend, oh, we're really, sensitive and nice. And yet they are in the way, seriously in the way, of the arts ever being able to sort of right their boat in better themselves. Now, in the case of Scotland, for a lot of years, the SNP thought, no, culture is what we use to talk to our own people. It's a domestic, internal thing. And then along came the referendum. They suddenly realized, oh no, it's about projecting. We need to project the idea of Scotland internationally. So they turned around and said, no, we've got to do more of that. But what a shower. They don't understand. They don't understand, no more than they understand industry, by the way, or big business. They don't have industrial policy. They don't understand how to talk to the unions. There's a kind of callous, careless dumbing down right across the pitch, so that in the arts, the money goes for box ticking. There are no artists involved in the giving of arts. They got rid of all the artist committees in the early 90s, and ever since then it's just been box ticking. Disaster.
Oh, this is the doom corner.
Doom.
Bring some light.
Final
Oh
thoughts,
gosh,
right?
that's quite a task. I suppose coming to the questions of or the issues of the value of culture. One of the things that strikes me in the conversations we've been having is how we define culture, who it's for, who it's by, and who supports it. And I think we could all come up with very different answers to those questions. As I've said, I was born and brought up in Zimbabwe. My father was a classical musician, and we didn't have very much experience talking in music terms of anything other than classical music. I think there were 2 cassettes or records in the house that were not classical music when I was growing up. And one of the things that I think we don't necessarily understand very well when we are talking about this is how the constraints around information, the constraints around experience, and the constraints around exposure affect our understandings, our internalizations, and our identities around culture. And I suppose that brings me to the point of thinking, well, how do we get that? And I think there's a fundamental role for the state in this around supporting funding not only the existence of a wide variety of the arts and supporting them in not a tick box way, but actually of opening up the opportunities for expression, opening up the opportunities for experience, because most of us don't have that, I think, and therefore how do we know that is something we want to and could flourish in? And I think that's the reason we don't have that is because it doesn't allow us to be compartmentalized into nice little economic cogs to fulfill the capitalist machine. So where does that leave us? I think thinking about this brings me back to something I've spoken about elsewhere before, is what as humans we are good at doing. We are good at interacting with other human beings on a variety of different levels, but fundamentally on levels of care. We care for each other. And I think if COVID has shown us nothing else, it's shown us that we care for each other. We care fundamentally and very deeply for each other. We may express that in very different ways, but that is core to being human. I think we also know that being creative is core to being human. And our political structures don't support that. Our democratic structures don't support that. And I do make a separation between political structures and democratic structures. And our societal structures don't necessarily support that very, very well. And I think unless we take those two together and come back around and talk about how we work together, how we cooperate, how we collaborate, we don't actually get a solution, or we don't allow culture to fulfill, I think, the embedded role in us as individuals and as collective parts of a wider society in a way that allows any of us to flourish. And I think that's a huge challenge. It's a challenge for me as a politician, but I think it's a challenge for each of us as within an interest in these ideas, these thoughts, these questions. Because if we don't do that and we only focus on very rarefied or very narrow views of what people need, and we talk about what is it that people need to exist at the moment in economically hard times. That's obviously clear. If culture isn't in the mix, I think we are being less than ourselves, and we are detracting from what it is to be human. And I think that's something that's a huge challenge for us all. And I think, if we can build on that and think about how that is fundamental to our essence, then we can start finding a way through some of these disagreements and some of these difficulties, because actually that's who we are.
Thanks, Maggie. And thanks to all of you for giving up your time. And I hope that we achieved what we wanted to achieve tonight, which was making sure that everyone has time to make the point that they want to make. And I hope everyone feels like they got to say what they wanted to say, and maybe you got to say some things that you didn't think you would say. But thank you very much for coming, and we'll hopefully see some of you again on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Did you say some of you?
Johnny and a mistake next one, Scott. Yeah.
Some of you are definitely cancelled.